In the autumn of 1871, the people of Ashbriar said the river could keep a secret if you fed it the right kind of lie. They said the cypress knees were just roots, not knuckles, the owls were just birds, not lookouts, the white sheets that moved at midnight were laundry lines catching moon. They said a lot of things. None of them mentioned the boy. Before we go any further, if you're listening in the dark or riding along empty road, hit subscribe to Tales Never Told and ring that bell so you don't miss what we're about to drag into daylight. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because the place you're from decides which stories come find you. Ashbriar wasn't a dot on any good map, just a ferry, a courthouse the color of old teeth, and a rail spur where freight jumped off the world for a drink. Folks called it a town to make their sins sound organized. Freedman called it something else under their breath. The year after the war ended, a man named Isaiah Reed settled on a wedge of land by the Blackwater, put up a square cabin and a straight fence, and taught his son, Josiah, to read names out loud so they couldn't be stolen. Isaiah had a Union canteen hanging by the door and a Bible with the deaths and births inked in a careful hand, pages that kept score even when courts refused. By October, the nights came early, as if daylight owed somebody money. That was when the men in white arrived, faces under sacks, voices borrowed from men who prayed with those same tongues on Sunday. They called themselves night riders, regulators, vigilantes, any word that hid the blunt fact of what they were. At the edge of Isaiah's fence line, they left a knot of rope and a scrap of muslin pinned with a bone button, like a child's toy made by someone who wanted children to flinch. The message wasn't complicated: don't try to vote, don't stand a witness, don't testify what you saw. Don't be. Isaiah didn't move. He hammered boards. He planted late winter greens. He walked Josiah to the schoolroom in the praise house, one room, one window, one teacher whose spine lived in the word no. He kept a ledger like the storekeeper kept, supplies, wages, promises, but Isaiah's column had a different title along the top: what they owe us. And under it, a short list: truth, safety, name. The sheriff said nobody could prove anything. The magistrate said crimes didn't travel after dark. The preacher said vengeance was the Lord's, but he said it with a hand that shook when he counted the collection. Men gave the same advice to Isaiah that men give when they're trying to talk themselves out of being brave: lay low. Wait it out. These things pass. But some things don't pass, they dig in. On a Wednesday with a corn moon climbing late, a shot cracked out behind the cotton gin, and Ashbriar woke up pretending it had slept through everything. By dawn, Isaiah's boy was gone. They found Josiah Reed in the cane, not yet cold, hands tied with the kind of knot men learn in barns. There's a mercy in fog, it erases detail. The neighbors used that mercy as a shield. They said tragic and senseless and unfortunate, the way people do when the truth is too sharp to pick up. The doctor looked at his shoes and signed a paper that made the county feel clean. And the river, polite as always, took the boy's name and held it just under the surface, where it hummed like a bell no one wanted to hear. The next morning, somebody chalked a mark on the courthouse step, a simple tally slash, and beside it, the word next. No one claimed it. Everyone owned it. News traveled the way it always does when fear is the messenger: uneven, fast where women gather water, slow where men gather excuses. A federal deputy, young, hat too big, papers too clean, rolled in with a satchel full of new laws stamped by a Congress tired of reading about murders like this. He carried the color of Washington on his coat, and the exhaustion of a man who had explained the same rule to men who broke it 5 days a week. His name was Fielding Glass. It sounded fancy until you saw the way he listened, like he was waiting for the room itself to confess. Fielding went to Isaiah's cabin and took down testimony while the wind pulled the door's hinge into a soft, sorrowful song. Isaiah didn't cry. He read names. Buck Satcher. Amos Drury. Enoch Pell. He spoke them like addresses. He pointed to the rope and to the quiet places in the grass and to the moon-marked ruts where hoofs had waited. Fielding wrote. He visited the praise house and asked the schoolteacher what she'd seen. He visited the white church and asked the preacher what he'd heard. He visited the gin and asked nobody anything, because blood makes its own kind of statement. That night someone set a cross on fire where the ferry road hooks left into the cattails. Ash Briar stood in its own light and pretended it was a sunrise. Fielding kept writing. He filed papers with the county, then wired the district attorney 3 towns over, where the trains ran on time and the law was still learning to walk out of bed before noon. You could feel the town hold its breath. You could feel the river hold it, too. If you leaned into the wind, you could hear 3 sounds braided tight: the creak of the courthouse weather vane, the far-off thud of men hammering new signs over old doors, and a bell that no church had rung. Isaiah dug a grave with a shovel that wasn't meant for a boy's length. The Freedman lined the path with lanterns and him, low, no show, the kind of singing that holds a room up when the beams want to fail. On Josiah's marker Isaiah burned 3 letters with a nail heated in the cook fire, J.R., because names want wood, ink, stone, something harder than breath. He tucked the boy's primer under the marker, and for a moment, if you squinted, you could see every letter the boy had ever learned rise like steam: A for Ash Briar, B for Bell, C for Case. Fielding Glass walked Josiah down to the ground with the others and kept his hat off in the rain. When the dirt settled, he stepped forward like he was making a bargain with the earth itself. "I will ask the grand jury for a bill," he said. "I will ask for men who ride in sheets to answer barefaced." He said it to Isaiah, to the teacher, to the lanterns, to the men in the tree lean who wore their fear like armor. He said it to the sheriff, who stared at his boots like the truth might come out of the leather. He said it to the preacher, who swallowed so hard it made the hymn falter for a breath. He said it to the magistrate, who muttered something about jurisdiction and weather. Most of all he said it to the town, because sometimes a threat and a promise are the same sound, and you need witnesses for both. The courthouse called 12 men to sit in judgment, 6 who could read, 4 who pretended, 2 who thought letters were magic tricks northern men used to steal farms. Isaiah was not allowed inside. Fielding Glass was. He carried a satchel of affidavits and a rope with a knot tied just so, and the muslin scrap with the bone button, and a list of names one of the women at the pump had whispered while she stared not at his face but at the place on his sleeve where an old bloodstain told her he, too, knew the weight of certain doors. The foreman from the mill sat in the chair and tapped the tabletop once with a ring that had seen more dice than vows. "Proceed," he said. He meant, "Make this quick." Fielding didn't make it quick. He read the act that said night riders were criminals, not traditions. He laid out the rope and the scrap and the facts and the route those hooves had taken. He called the teacher and he called the ferryman and he called a boy named Duncan who had seen the white sheets fold themselves into saddles in the yard behind the feed store. He called the town's blacksmith, who said the bone button was carved by a hand that favored the left. He called a woman whose porch looked like a quiet place, who told a story about voices you could hear through a sack. The sheriff sat in the back row like a man doing math bad on purpose. Now and then he smiled when the room looked his way, not because he was happy, but because smiling is what a man does when his face is the only lie he can still control. The preacher did better. He frowned with authority, because frowning feels like action. In the jury box, Enoch Pell, the feed store man, wrote something in his pocket notebook and shut it very softly when he noticed Fielding watching. Out in the hall, Isaiah waited with his hat in his hands and the shovel leaning against the wall like a witness that couldn't speak. The Praise House teacher brought him coffee in a jar and quoted a psalm with the edges worn off. The ferryman whittled a twig into a point sharp enough to write in dirt. The air felt like it does right before a storm decides whether to crawl or run. An hour later, the foreman came out and posted the verdict on a nail by the door. It wasn't the full word, it was the absence of one. No bill. Easy letters. Quick to write. They looked so clean you could almost miss the smear where the ink had dragged in an oval, like someone's hand had hesitated a second too long. Fielding Glass looked at the smear and then at the foreman's ring and then at the sheriff's unscuffed boots. He took the paper down, very politely, and held it up to the light slanting past the courthouse rafters. Letters are stubborn. Even when you try to erase them, they remember how they started. In the thin angle of afternoon sun, a faint, wet shadow rose where the foreman's pen had begun a different word and then stopped, Guil. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You got your answer," he said. He said it the way a man closes a door but keeps his hand on the knob. Fielding smiled, small, almost fond, like a teacher seeing a child try an old trick badly. "I did," he said. Then he folded the paper, tucked it in his satchel, and left without putting his hat back on. Outside, he shook Isaiah's hand for longer than Breyer thought necessary and said, "We're not done. We just changed doors." That night, the white sheets wrote again. They didn't know which door he meant, so they tried all of them. They knocked at the Praise House window with a knife hilt and whispered that Sunday was coming. They set a hayrick on fire and called it a warning. They dragged across to the ferry lip and stood around it without lighting it, like men attending their own rehearsal. They sent the sheriff to Isaiah's fence line with a friendly word and a threat tucked inside it like a blade. "Go," he said. "For your own good." Isaiah looked at his gate, the one Josiah had fixed with 2 nails and a laugh, and said, "My own good is buried here." Somewhere between midnight and moonfall, somebody slid a small wrapped package under the courthouse door. Fielding found it just before dawn when he came back like he had forgotten his hat. Inside, a page torn from a church ledger, names written in a different hand than the preacher's, times and places marked in the margins with a code a schoolteacher could break before breakfast. And along the bottom edge, where the paper had torn ragged, a strip of muslin pinned with a bone button, left-handed, cut quick. Ash Breyer woke to rain that smelled like iron. Men said it was the season. Women said it was the truth washing its face. The sheriff said nothing at all. He stood at his window and watched water chew at the dirt under the gallows post. Fielding Glass lit a lamp and began reading the ledger page while the courthouse clock forgot itself and struck 13. Fielding Glass read the torn ledger page as if it might bleed. Names rode the margins in a schoolgirl's hand, too neat for the men it served, meetings marked as singings, rides as visitations, the gin loft called the upper room. Along the bottom, a date that hadn't happened yet, Saturday, after moonrise, choir practice by the Turpentine Works. The bone button hung off the page like a wink from a ghost. By noon, Fielding had 3 things: a warrant signed by a circuit judge a county away, a letter ready for the U.S. attorney, and a list of men who would never speak to him in daylight but would pass a message at a pump handle: the ferryman, the Praise House teacher, the blacksmith whose hammer had a conscience, and a woman who sold thread by the yard and could tell you which hands pulled it left instead of right. He walked a line between courtesy and defiance, hat tipped to the preacher at his gate, eyes level on the sheriff at his window. Saturday, he said to no one and everyone. "I'll be there." The sheriff held up a hand the way men do when they want to look like a barrier but feel like a door. "You're making a mistake," he said. Fielding kept walking. "I brought paper for mistakes," he said. "And rope for corrections." Night came down like a lid. Men in white rode by Isaiah's fence and dropped a sack with stones tied to it, a message meant to sink. Isaiah cut it open. Inside, a child's primer, just like Josiah's, with the letters scissored out. He set the sack aside and fixed the fence plank that had creaked since spring. When he was done, he set his son's name into the dark and felt the syllables push back, solid as wood. Saturday wore a righteous blue until the light went wrong. Fielding took the back road with the ferryman, stepping between puddles that remembered boots. The Turpentine Works stood like a rib cage against the sky. The men in white came by ones and twos, like moths pretending not to know a candle. Fielding crouched in the pines and counted breaths. At his signal, the blacksmith doused the lantern nearest the trail. Darkness took the ground in a gulp. "Federal," Fielding called, voice quiet as a knife drawn from cloth. No sermon. No flourish. He stepped out with the badge and the paper and the bone button pinned to his cuff. The riders hesitated, that fraction of a second when a mask remembers it is a sack. The ferryman moved first, hooking a hood and yanking it back like a curtain. A face flinched in the raw air, Amos Drury, who sang loud on Sunday and louder when he hurt things. They broke. Men who preach order love chaos when it is theirs to steer. Fielding didn't fire. He did something worse, he named. "Buck Satcher," he shouted, pointing as a horse wheeled. Enoch Pell, as a boot slipped in the resin. "Sheriff's man, third rider, drop the pistol. Names have weight." They pulled at spines. Two ran straight into the blacksmith's shoulders and found out iron keeps its promises. By the time the owl remembered to call, 3 riders were down, 4 had fled, and a sack split open to spill a roster stitched into a hymn book's lining. Fielding cut the ropes from a boy tied by the wrists in the shadows, Duncan, the stable hand who slept by the feed bins. He was shaking so hard the knot came loose on its own. "You saw faces," Fielding said, not asking, just putting a plank down where the boy could step. Duncan nodded. "The left-handed one carved the buttons," he whispered. "He prays with his blade. He stands at the far end when they say amen." The sheriff arrived late with men and excuses. He stared at the hymn book on the ground, at the names pricked into its leather like a confession written in braille. "This is going too far," he said. Fielding set the bone button on top of the book, not unkindly. "No," he said. "This is going exactly far enough." Ashbriar liked its sins local. Federal law felt like weather. It came from away, it ruined your hat, and there was no use arguing with it. Fielding sent his riders, the ferryman, the blacksmith, one veteran whose arm still woke screaming, to the gin, the feed store, the preacher's yard where the laurel made a lovely blind. They collected small proofs the way old women collect buttons, a strip of muslin with a hem ironed crooked, a scrap of paper with a meeting time disguised as a baptism, a heel scraping resin off a boot heel that shouldn't have known pine. At the praise house, the teacher brought out a child's slate. On it she'd chalked the stops and starts of a prayer meeting that wasn't a prayer meeting at all. "They practice their songs behind the gin," she said. "And the river answers wrong." In the federal room 2 counties over, the circuit judge smelled like bay rum and stubbornness. Fielding laid his proofs on the table, the roster hidden in the hymn book, the bone button, the ledger page that had walked under the courthouse door on its own legs. He didn't dress them up. He said the boy's name first, because the dead deserve podiums. "Josiah Reed," he said. "Age 14. Read to the end of his primer. Tied with a farmer's knot. 3 riders seen. 1 left-handed. Saturday night after harvest in the cane by the gin." The judge flipped the paper like he was turning ribs on a spit. "Do you have the rope?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Fielding said, and put it in his hands the way a son gives his father a tool he doesn't trust himself to use without breaking. The judge held the rope and closed his eyes a second longer than men with power usually allow themselves. "Very well," he said. "You have your bill." Back in Ashbriar, the sheriff paced the floor until the boards went smooth under his boots. His deputy whispered the way men do when they'd practiced bravado and found it short in the night. "We ain't crossing the feds," the deputy said. The sheriff stared at his own reflection, a ghost in window glass. "We aren't," he agreed, but at midnight his horse stood saddled anyway. Letters moved faster than guilt. Newspapers bit the story and chewed until it tasted like a moral. "Outrage in ASH Briar," they printed. "Federal justice to test the night." Some editor with ink on his fingers added a line that made the ferryman laugh and Isaiah smile without humor: "The law rides after dark." Fielding swore in witnesses one by one. Duncan told what he'd seen from the hayloft, men pulling sacks over heads as if modesty were a virtue here, the left-hander carving bone with a little saw meant for trimming harness, the sheriff's man making a joke the Lord should have interrupted. The blacksmith said he'd fixed a spur rowel for Buck Satcher and saw pine resin packed in its teeth after a night with no storm. The teacher said nothing about fear and everything about time, what hour the riders came, what moon made shadows long enough to hide a face, what hymn the preacher had tested on Sunday that turned up as a signal on Saturday. Isaiah didn't give the court his grief. He gave it his memory. He spoke clean, like a ledger, when the rope knocked against the fence board, when the horses sidled near the cane, when he called his boy's name and the river answered back with a sound like a door closing. He did not cry. That lack filled the room until men looked at their boots because there are silences you ought to tip your hat to. The defense did what men do when caught with blood they swear is paint. They attacked the eyes that saw them. They called Duncan a boy liar, they called the teacher an agitator with chalk, they called the ferryman a thief of tides. Fielding didn't raise his voice. He held up the bone button and the judge leaned forward without meaning to. Left-handed, Fielding said, simple as pointing at weather. Cut on a Thursday, dyed in well water, sewn with white thread spun coarse. There is one man in Ashbriar who wears his jacket with buttons like this. I asked the court to look, just look, at Enoch Pell. Enoch tried bravado first. He smiled at the teacher like she owed him a favor. He adjusted his sleeves as if dignity were something any man could order in his size. But when he put his right hand on the Bible, it sat wrong. The judge tilted his head the way hounds do when a sound is almost too high to hear. Left hand, sir, he said. Enoch swallowed. His eyes went from the sheriff to the preacher to the door. Doors didn't love him back. Bill's true, the grand jury wrote on 2 names. On 4 they wrote nothing at all. The judge set trial. Men in white wrote letters under doors. A cat was left dead on the praise house step with its throat neatly tied. That neatness was the worst of it. The night they came for Isaiah, the river warned him first. A plank brushed the bank where it shouldn't, slow as a breath. Isaiah blew the lamp and sat with his back to the wall, counting the space between sounds: frog, owl, leather creak, hinge. The men who knock to hurt you always knock polite. Mr. Reed, a voice said, church clean. We need your testimony cleared up, is all. Isaiah answered without moving. Which word? He asked. Boy? Rope? Or the name I said without your mask on? He heard the intake, 3 men surprised to find their face had shape in the dark. The door eased. The first man stepped through. The ferryman swung from the shadow like a door on a good hinge. Wood met bone, and the night lost its manners. They weren't trained for people who remembered being hunted and had stopped being polite about it. Isaiah moved like a man who dug more graves than he'd filled, efficient, precise, no theater. When it was done, one ran limping, one lay still, one whimpered the way men do when their courage rolls out the door and keeps going. Isaiah tied him with his own sash and said, say his name. The man tried 3 wrong ones before he risked the truth. Pell, he hiccuped. Enoch. He sets the hours. Fielding came fast, hat crooked, shirt wrong, pistol sober. He looked at the tide man and at the plank the river had set moving like a spying eye. You all right? He asked Isaiah. No, Isaiah said. But I'm here. They moved Isaiah that same night to the courthouse cellar and gave him a cot, a Bible, a broken chair, and a bell rope that went up through the ceiling to a tongue that hadn't rung right since the last war. If they come, Fielding said, ring. Isaiah put his palm on the rope and felt the church's throat resting there, asleep and guilty. At dawn, the praise house teacher carried a tin box to Fielding. Inside, under cloth, were scraps, thread matched to muslin, a note written in a woman's hand that said remember to turn the heels facing left, a hymn line, the Lord sees in secret, inked over 3 dates. Sewing circle, she said softly. Not just wives. Sisters. Daughters. They fold the sheets and pass the buttons like they're making quilts. She didn't need to add the last thought. Evil loves community. The blacksmith's apprentice came in on his own feet and left on lighter ones. He was a narrow boy with hands that didn't match. They'd grown while the rest of him hadn't. He stared at the bone button and swallowed twice before words found him. Mr. Pell says carving bone shows you're steady, he said. Says it keeps your touch strong for when the knife has to go gentle. Fielding met the boy's eyes. Did your mama sew the hems? He asked. The boy flinched like truth had teeth. She did hems for everybody, he said. But I started noticing left thread phrase different. It fuzzes. Like a whisper. Whispers turned to maps. The boy marked where the riders changed, behind the feed store, under the preacher's laurel, at the gin loft where resin masked the smell of breath. He marked the river place where the ferry slows on purpose and the men step off their horses to pray like soldiers, heads down, mouths counting. He drew a square for the sheriff's back door and pointed at the step with the squeak in it. He keeps his boots there, he said, voice small. Mud tells on men. Resin is loud. Fielding took what he had to the circuit judge. I want troops at the ferry, he said. I want the sheriff's step scraped and bagged. The judge sighed like the country did when it remembered its conscience on an inconvenient day. "I'll send 12, and a wagon," he said. 12 soldiers looked smaller on the road than on paper. Still, the town felt the air change. The preacher came late to everything that week. He walked up Fielding's steps at dusk like a man taking a dose he delayed until it went bitter. He set a hatbox down and stood with his hands folded like prayer had a posture he could borrow. Fielding opened the lid. Inside, a ledger. Not the ledger. A cousin of it. A list of donations for music nights, each line initialed with letters that couldn't have meant anything but did. On the inside cover, a note, "Forgive me I didn't stop this sooner." The preacher couldn't look up. "My daughter wrote the page that went under your door," he said, voice shredded. "She heard them use my church like a stable and couldn't stand the stink anymore." Fielding didn't thank him. Gratitude would have made it small. "Tell the jury that," he said. The preacher shook his head. "They won't forgive me," he said. Fielding shrugged. "That's not what this is for," he said. "This is for the boy." The federal courtroom felt like a throat about to shout. People packed in, women with their hair pinned too tight, men with their collars starched into sermons, Freedman standing because the benches had filled and no one offered space. Soldiers took the corners and tried to make their eyes neutral. The judge came out with his bay rum and something hungry behind his eyes. He'd tried cases where the law was a ghost. He wanted one where law made a noise. Enoch Pell sat like he was at a picnic. Buck Satcher chose Farrell instead, chin up, mouth ready. The sheriff took a seat behind them, hat low, hand on his cane like it had a secret. Fielding opened by not opening. He stood silent until the room tangled itself up in its own breath. When the first murmur rose, he spoke the only name that cut through it clean. "Josiah," he said. "No mister. No surname. Just the bell of it." He read alligator by sounding it out without fear, Fielding said. He fixed a fence plank wrong and laughed and fixed it right. He had a primer with the letters carried away by a hand that thought it was God. "I am not here to teach you grief. I am here to make you say what you did when you thought night hid you." He called the praise house teacher. She didn't perform. She told time. She put her hand on the Bible like she was checking its pulse, and she said what hour the writers met, and how the hymn they hummed when they turned their horses matched the line the preacher had tested 2 days before in his choir. She laid the hatbox ledger flat and let the judge read names that didn't want air. He called the blacksmith's apprentice. The boy sweated like truth costs. He held up a button and explained the left-handed carve, how the blade leans, how the groove dips on the wrong side, how thread frays like breath when you pull it through too fast. He pointed to Enoch Pell and said, barely above a whisper, "He makes them." Enoch smiled, the kind of grin men wear when they've used it to pull women out of their own doors. "I donate to choirs," he said. "I pray with both hands." Fielding walked to the witness bench and put the bone button in front of him. "Sew it," he said, and slid a needle across the rail. The judge lifted an eyebrow. "I'll allow it," he said. "The truth should sometimes be practical." Enoch took the needle. He jabbed it twice, then 3 times, then cursed softly the way boys do when their father isn't watching. The thread fuzzed on the wrong side. The jury watched the fuzz bloom like mold. Fielding didn't smile. He took the bone back like a father taking a blade from a child. "Left-handed," he said, gentle. "Even your lies have a dominant hand." They went to the river at night because that's where the crime had decided itself, and the judge wanted to feel the particular cold you can't put into a transcript. Soldiers stood far enough back not to scare the frogs. Isaiah led the way. He walked like a man who'd learned the ground by the pains in his feet. "Here," he said, and pointed to a place that looked like any other until you bent down and smelled the resin that shouldn't have been there. Buck Satcher snorted. "Pine moves," he said. "So does mud." The judge said nothing. He crouched. He put his hand in the earth like a farmer. He came up with a flake of dyed muslin so small it wanted to be a lie. Fielding took the jury the rest of the way without moving their boots. His voice made the map. They came here because the ferry makes men feel invisible, he said. They tied a boy with a knot I can teach with 3 fingers closed. They sang a hymn wrong. Then they rode past the feed store, listened to the step squeak, and they cut through the preacher's laurel, smell the sap where a spur tore it. They went to the gin and hung their sacks in the loft, and left one button under a beam where the blacksmith's apprentice found it after dawn. The sheriff cleared his throat. Plenty of men wear buttons, he said. The judge looked at his boots. Resin glimmered in the stitch where leather meets honesty. Do plenty of sheriffs? The judge asked, mild. The room didn't breathe for a count of 7. Fielding didn't pounce. Mercy can be a tactic. Your step has resin, he said. You can either say why yourself, or I can ask your house to testify. The sheriff's hand tightened on the cane like it had a throat. Verdicts don't fall single. They come in clumps, like rain. The jury found 2 guilty, 1 not guilty, 1 undecided, and 2 they couldn't look in the face long enough to name. The judge sentenced the pair he had, prison to the north, where winters cut different, where men from regiments with numbers for names stood watch. The town buzzed like a hive that had been kicked and couldn't decide whether to swarm or die. That night, the writers tried to take back what the law had borrowed. They came for Isaiah at the courthouse cellar. They tried the door with a polite knock, they tried the window with a knife, they tried the bell rope with a laugh. Isaiah didn't laugh. He hauled the rope the way a man pulls a friend out of water. The bell rang 13 again, wrong, loud, honest. The sound put iron in men's legs. Soldiers ran. At the back step, the sheriff stood under his own window, staring at his boots like the truth might sneak up through the soles. He had his cane in one hand and his hat in the other. When the bell hit its 7th wrong note, he made a choice nobody in Ashbriar had budgeted for. He stepped into the alley and took the first hood with a cane like a farmer threshing wheat. No more in my window, he said. His voice wasn't brave. It was tired in a way that scares men who still think they have choices. A shot cracked. The sheriff went down like a door closing. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a villain, he was a hinge, and he broke. The bell didn't stop ringing. It rang for him too. The preacher told the jury his daughter had used his paper against his friends. He didn't cry. He said, I taught her letters, and let the room do the rest. He named the men who'd knelt under his laurel and pretended it was prayer. He named the women who'd stitched sheets and thought the Lord didn't see stitches. When he finished, he didn't ask forgiveness. He set the hatbox ledger down and folded his hands like he was finally empty of tricks. New affidavits walked out of the dark. Women put names in Fielding's palm at the pump and didn't look up. Boys chalked times under the ferry bench and walked away before the chalk dried. The blacksmith found a hood stuffed behind his forge, his own, slid up the back with a neat left-handed cut, a note pinned, I'm done. Pell started looking smaller in rooms where he used to stand like a stove. The Praise House teacher woke to a rope on her porch and a letter with the spelling too careful to be honest. Before fear could decide what shape to take, a soldier knocked like a neighbor and sat on her steps with a Bible on his knee and a pistol on the porch rail where a breeze could see it. The town exhaled without meaning to. Sometimes justice looks like a man in a blue coat watching the road with no theater at all. Pell didn't go down by paper. Men like him make themselves verbs, they demand action. He called a meeting at the gin and opened with a prayer that tried to borrow God's base. Then he told his den they were walking to the courthouse, taking the ledger and the boy's father and the deputy and the bell and setting fire to the whole throat of law. Men love finales. They like the way smoke erases handwriting. Fielding knew before he heard because the river told him. A raft broke from its mooring and drifted toward the ferry lip like a finger pointing wrong. He put 12 soldiers at the back door, the ferryman in the rafters, Isaiah in the cellar with the rope. He took the rest to the ferry road and stood in the middle of it, badge like a moon in his hand. Enoch, he said to the dark. Come talk. It's your last chance to use your face. Pell walked out of the laurel with his hands open like a preacher. You aren't from here, he said. You don't understand what stays put and what floats off. Fielding nodded. I know exactly what floats, he said. Boys' names. Ledger pages. Lies. He stepped aside and let the soldier's boots do the next sentence. The fight was short and ugly, like most truths. Pell ran for the ferry and found the ferryman waiting, pole set, eyes wrong with a kind of kindness that doesn't forgive. They struggled. Pell grabbed for the pole and got the water instead. Men can swim when they aren't scared. He wasn't that kind of man. The river opened politely and took him in. It doesn't argue with certain weights. Trials finished without fanfare. 2 more guilty. 1 vanished before a verdict, his hat turned up on a gatepost like a bad joke. The judge signed papers that would make other men in other counties nervous. The preacher resigned his pulpit and sat on his porch teaching his daughter to braid rope into a line strong enough to tie packages of letters shut. The praise house teacher put out 3 extra slates and filled them all. Fielding packed. Paper weighs more when it's done its work. He set the bone button in his satchel side pocket and tucked the hatbox ledger in the bottom under his clean shirt. He wrote 2 letters, one to the circuit judge saying it wasn't enough, and one to his mother saying it was something. Isaiah walked him to the ferry at dusk. They stood where the plank had knocked the bank the night the riders came. The ferryman held the pole the way a man holds a child's hand, ready to let go, ready to grip. "I can't leave," Isaiah said. "I know," Fielding answered. "He's here." Isaiah nodded. He had a little box in his pocket, just big enough for a boy's primer scrap and a nail and a button not carved from bone. He opened it and put the scrap under a rock. He liked the letter G, he said. "Because it looks like a door that won't close all the way." They listened. The river made its old sounds, the ones you don't notice until you've learned new meanings for them, roots knocking the bank like knuckles, owls saying names without vowels, frogs counting. Somewhere in the dark, a bell rang once where it shouldn't. It could have been a mistake. It could have been a thank you. Years don't erase, they palimpsest. Ashbriar kept its courthouse but changed the color of its paint twice. The gin burned down by accident on purpose. The preacher's laurel grew back the shape of a question mark. Children learned letters that were allowed to stand in daylight. The praise house teacher married late and taught until her hair went as white as the sheet she'd refused to fold. The ferryman grew old and gentled and told stories about nights when the river spoke louder than men. The sheriff's stone stayed plain. Somebody, no one would say who, left a cane against it every April. Enoch Pell didn't get a marker. The river doesn't spend wood on men who ask to be water. The ledger in the hatbox went to a room with locks and a clerk who believed in alphabet more than favors. The page that had walked under the door stayed in Fielding's satchel, creased and faithful. Sometimes he took it out and looked at the bone button and thought about the left-handed carve and how careful men are when they want to be cruel. Isaiah dug a new fence post every spring, even when the fence didn't need it. He said it was for the exercise. It wasn't. It was to put his hands in the same dirt each year and tell it his son's name until the soil wore smooth on the syllables. When he died, old, with a back that had carried more than any one life's share, the praise house children sang a hymn with the line the preacher had misused once and redeemed by witness later, "The Lord sees in secret." They sang it right. The bell rang 12. Then it rang one more, wrong on purpose. As for the ledger, the one that held the first O's and the worst schedules, some say it exists still. Some say the preacher's daughter sealed it and hid it in a wall where heat won't find it. Some say the circuit judge burned what he couldn't carry and called it mercy. Others say the river has it, which is the same as saying the town does, since the river is the part of Ashbriar that doesn't lie. What is known is this: a boy named Josiah read to the end of Alligator without skipping. A man named Isaiah said his son's name until the air learned how to hold it. A federal man who listened more than he talked wrote letters until the paper ran out of quiet. And a town that loved white sheets learned that fabric remembers hands. Do you think the missing ledger still sits behind someone's wall, waiting for a night when the bell remembers how to ring 13? Do you think the river keeps names or gives them back when asked kindly enough? Tell me what you believe down in the comments. If this story held your breath the way it held mine, subscribe to Tales Never Told and ring that bell so the next hard truth finds you. Share this with someone who thinks the past learned its lesson without witnesses. These voices deserve daylight. I'll see you in the next one.